So, Chris, you've often worked with Armando Iannucci, most recently on The Death of Stalin. Tell us a little bit about how that relationship between you as the composer and he as the writer-director has changed and developed over time.
Right. Well, yeah, I joined Veep at the very start, and my sense was that so Veep is a sort of a cousin of a British show called The Thick of It. It doesn't sort of take place in the same political universe, but it's in a similar style, and it's taking a similar look at things. So I was aware when I heard about Veep. I'm a big fan of The Thick of It, and I was aware that The Thick of It has no music at all. Um, but then Washington and Westminster are a little bit different in their foibles and follies. And in Westminster, sort of the prevailing atmosphere is one of kind of wretchedness. Everyone always seems to be followed by the tabloids. No one can get away. Politicians always seem to have bits of paper stuck under their arm that are blowing away in the wind. So it sort of suits it to have no music at all. And I'm sure when Armando came to think more about Washington D.C. with motorcades going everywhere and security details, there was suddenly a feeling that you couldn't do this show without music at all. But I was aware that he was coming from a very dialogue centered place. That he was coming from a place of having no music at all and being very cautious about it. So we started there, and we sort of came up with this sound for Veep, which I always thought of as a sort of combination of sort of imaginary composer somewhere between Aaron Copland and John Adams. Super American and super enthused about the presidency. But it was interesting because Armando is actually a real authority on classical music. We're both very, very into classical music, but Veep only afforded us these tiny little slices of music to sort of think about music in comedy and to try things. So when Stalin came along, there was this great feeling of release. We had this big conversation about Soviet composers, and we realized that we were going to be needing these great slabs of music to take us through some quite complicated scenes. So it was very much a feeling of opening up, and now we can really sort of try some stuff out.
You mentioned the Soviet composers. So this movie takes place in Russia. It's all about the death of Stalin. The title says it all. So I guess how did that rich history of music? Can you just talk a little bit more about how that influenced your score for this?
Right. Well, we had found early on, looking at the style of the film and trying things out, that it worked very well to actually tempt the film with Soviet music. It seemed to be accomplishing various things. As time went on, I started to think of it as the film as being in a tradition that almost has something in common with Young Frankenstein or with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where if the music plays it very straight, it's slightly old-fashioned, but plays it very straight, it can achieve this very nice effect with the comedy. Sometimes it's very, very jarring and doing the opposite of what we're seeing, and sometimes it's just playing all the bits that aren't comedy. So we talked a lot about Soviet composers, because the famous name that everybody knows is Shostakovich. Prokofiev is a little bit less relevant because he was coming and going, in terms of that culture. But there's actually a whole school of composers, a whole world of composers that we were thinking about, and that I was researching. Weinberg is the one that I've started to feel very passionate about, because I think he's very good, and he's not someone that most people know about. So there's a nervous, manic quality in a lot of Soviet music from the 50s, and we were discovering that could be a sort of underpinning to the film. Armando had this phrase of why don't we just imagine that we had resurrected the Soviet Union's finest composer and just given that person the task of doing it. And so I started to feel, I don't know how slavishly he had in mind, but as I worked on it, I realized that it could be a very clever effect if there was no temp, there was no actual Soviet music in the score, but the thing were written as though it were this huge, very pompous Soviet composition. Actually, maybe sort of more like a symphony than like film music, so that you would hear these little snatches of it throughout the film, and they would sound like they were part of some big symphonic work. And so with that in mind, there was a certain sort of pretentiousness that I wanted to get in there. You know, there's all these fugatos and there's all these cues that sound like developments of something that you never actually heard before. It all sounds very into itself, and I even wanted maybe to have it be slightly more pompous than that stuff normally is, or maybe a little bit like the newsreel music, the film music, the propaganda music that those guys were writing.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of pretentiousness sort of works in balance with the comedy. I mean, the film has a very delicate tone to it. I mean, as all of his work does. Yeah, so I mean, it really does suit the absurdity of it very well.
There were some places that felt tonally very easy. There's a fun moment. We've been introduced to the characters with these slow-mo things, and then there's a very surprising moment where about half the film has gone by, and suddenly there's another one when we meet Zhukov for the first time, and there's almost a feeling in the viewer of like, oh, we're still doing these slow-mos, are we? Okay. Suddenly it goes into slow motion, and that one is incredibly huge and militaristic. Actually, my biggest worry with that one was that it wouldn't sound Soviet, that it would go so sort of so big that it would sound like Star Wars or something. But some of the early ones, like the very first one, where we meet Khrushchev for the first time, and he happens to be doing that weird sort of belly dance with Beria, and it's ridiculous, but we know that even if we don't really know the story, we know that Khrushchev is going to be important, and we have a strong feeling that we're about to see some very dark stuff happening. But we've got these two middle-aged men bumping stomachs. And that one was tricky because there was a sense that the music could introduce some sense of tragedy. If it went too far, I think it would sort of tip its hat. If it didn't go far enough, it would just sort of, you wouldn't really notice the music. So they had been trying to find something that they could show me that would be inspirational, and we couldn't really find anything. So in the end, that was one of the first pieces that I wrote, and we put that straight in the film because because that it was capturing that tone, whereas they hadn't really found any temp that was able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other particularly difficult moments for you to try to figure out in this?
There was there are a few cues where which I really had to leave till last. You know, I started composing very slowly because I was constantly going back and forth between all my Soviet scores and the thing that I was doing, trying to get more and more into the headspace of that style. I noticed, sorry, this is not answering the question, but I noticed early on my initial idea of what Soviet music was like was much too atonal, or was significantly too dissonant. I sort of had this vague, unstudied idea of what that music was like as being very difficult and tortured, and it was about 40%, 50% less dissonant than I thought. It's actually it's mostly tonal, with the odd wrong thing, or the odd very unconventional where the two voices disagree about where they're going. So at the start, I was going very slowly and cautiously, and I really had to leave the more convoluted cues to the end when I was really able to do it sort of without overthinking it. And the trickiest one, I think, in that sense, is when the trains are restarted. There's quite a long queue. The trains are not supposed to be letting people into Moscow, and Khrushchev, he doesn't even quite know why, but he decides he's just going to shake stuff up. He's run out of options, really, and he just does this in his little political battle that he's having. He starts the train, so we see the people around Moscow being led onto trains, and the music gets very, very, very big. Then it has to come down because we come back to Moscow and we haven't seen any of the people yet. And then it has to grow up and up and up and up, and it has to be. We have to start worrying about what's going to happen to them and whether the NKVD are going to open fire. But I wanted it to do all these things in a very non-filmic way. You know, we didn't want to have a sense that the music was just Mickey Mousing and you could hear it telling you what to think. You know, wanted to sort of sound like a symphony, but just one that happened to have the maneuvers that the scene needed. So that was pretty challenging.
Mm-hmm. Now you're currently working on Iannucci's next movie, which of all things is about David Copperfield. So can you tell us a little bit, just give us a hint of what we have to look forward to for that, or tell us a bit about how that's going?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's very early days for me, but I've seen a first cut of the film. It's very it's funny, and it's I've been reading the book, and we've been talking about the book really sort of for the last year, while Stalin's been coming out, and I was feeling, and then I found out that Armando very much feels this too, that David Copperfield is very funny, and is normally done in far too sort of ponderous and serious fashion. I mean, there are various serious things. The plot has to go to a very serious place, and so I think in the way lots of people have thought about it, that's dominated. But the characters are so bizarre, you know, and the interactions they have are so bizarre, that there's just an immense amount of eccentricity, almost sort of, you know, mental derangement on display. You might know that the film has this colorblind casting, so Dev Patel is David Copperfield.
Yes.
Even though Copperfield was sort of pretty obviously based on Dickens himself. So and beyond the colorblind casting, there's a certain quality in the film of just it doesn't feel slavish. It looks very 19th century, but it's a lot of fun. It doesn't feel safe or sort of you know, like a BBC version. So the music is I think not going to be particularly in a sort of 19th century world. I think it will be much more all over the place, but it'll be organic. You know, be orchestral, and Armando has very you know, adventurous tastes. You know, he loves classical music. He loves 20th century music. So it's possible to go to all sorts of crazy places that don't really sound like most movies. I'm not much sure of much beyond that, but it's really exciting.
I look forward to seeing it. Before I let you go, you've been Emmy nominated before for your work on something totally different for
Yes.
Mickey Mouse. You also just got a British Independent Film Award nomination for this movie. So just in terms of awards recognition, what does that mean for you?
It was the Emmy nomination for the song was just so wonderful and unexpected. You know, I didn't really write songs when I first moved to LA, but the Mickey Mouse shorts has sort of led me in in that direction. I always loved, you know, the Great American Songbook. I always loved melody. I've always been obsessed with melody. And when I started the Mickey shorts, we didn't realize there'd be songs. And then one after another, certain episodes needed songs, and I started writing them. Now I have a songwriting partnership with my wife, so we write songs together. So, and the shorts have been going since what, 2011, 2012. So it's turning into quite a major part of my life. And Elise and I that's my wife. We just finished a new song for Mickey Mouse the other day. So that's been very, that the Emmy for a song, Emmy nomination for a song was just really kind of special.
Yeah, you've joined a long tradition of Disney original tunes. So, well, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the film.
Oh, thanks very much. Great talking to you.
Same here. Have a good one.
Talk soon.
Same here.